Well, good morning, everyone. I've got 9 o'clock on my clock here, so I think we'll go ahead and get started to make sure we stay on time today. So first of all, thank you all for joining us. This is the second webinar in a three-part series looking at electric vehicle adoption, specifically here in Montana, and what some of sort of the challenges or opportunities might be with that. So in our first section back on January 28th, we had three different presenters kind of set the stage for some of the things that we're talking about today. We had Larry Flynn talk about Montana Department of Transportation funding and where that funding comes from, and some of the possibilities that might happen if a portion of the fleet shifted maybe to electric vehicles, and some kind of background on that aspect there. So we also had Nick Schrager, who's a retired associate professor here from MSU of electrical engineering, also an EV owner, kind of set the stage for a consumer perspective on electric vehicles and some history and some opportunities going forward. And then we wrapped up that first session with Kyle Mackey with the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, kind of laying out where the current infrastructure for charging stations is and what the electric vehicle fleet in Montana looks like currently. So if you missed that session, we did record it. It's on our website. So the same website that you logged into today, that recording there is available to you. And as an organizer, we post those and it tells us how many people have viewed it. So we had great attendance at the first session, and the recording had more than twice as many people watch it as we had attend. So I think that was a pretty good session there as well. A couple housekeeping notes for today. Please send questions in either through the chat window or through the question and answer, and I will capture those, and then when we get an opportunity at the end of each speaker's presentation, we'll pose questions to that presenter. And we may also catch up with a few at the very end today if there's some questions that slipped through as well. And we're also going to have Nick Schrager available at the end of the session to help with our question and answer there as well. He presented last series, won't be a presenter today, but we may ask some questions for Nick at the end. So if you've got some follow-up questions, please keep in mind that he's a resource that we can ask questions to as well. So our first presenter today is going to be David Kack, who's the Executive Director of MSU's Western Transportation Institute, which is a pretty interesting kind of enterprise part of MSU, located there behind the football stadium, and they've got some research networks that span across the state. So I noticed one of their facilities in Lewistown a few years back that I wasn't sure was theirs when I took a little driving school, was on their facility there. So David's going to give us some perspective he's got sort of from the transportation planning and infrastructure side of things. So with that, David, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Joel. And I hope that everyone who is on this did attend the first session. If not, if Joel said that's recorded, and certainly to have people take a look at that, because Nick provided some interesting history talking about even electric trains and things in the state. And then Larry talked about kind of the funding where we are now and the thoughts if we transition. And as we said, Kyla presented some interesting information on the state of EVs right now, making up about 0.2% of the vehicles in the state, but certainly I think we'll see that percentage continue to rise. And then some of the things about having the infrastructure to charge those vehicles. So I'm going to talk a little bit from a broader transportation perspective and bring some other things to the group to discuss. So when we talk about transportation, a lot of us all of a sudden default to the automobile or to other vehicles. We are a car society. Since World War II, it's been about building roads and having vehicles. So we think about that infrastructure. Where are we driving our cars? We might think about the maintenance of that infrastructure. And then certainly when we're all driving the same place at the same time, the congestion that might cause. Here at the Western Transportation Institute, we think about transportation pretty broadly. So animal vehicle interactions, what we call road ecology, looking at alternative modes, looking at in the northern climates how we de-ice and anti-icers and the corrosion that causes, how we move freight through rural areas, how we manage incidents, how we think about distracted driving, and what can we do to consider alternative modes, whether it's just biking or public transportation. So again, a lot of times when we think about mobility, being able to get out and about, again, we tend to focus on the automobile, and we think about, again, in rural areas, what can we look at? Can we invest in public transportation? Think about van pooling. Can we get bike sharing going in rural areas? How those modes might intersect, that you can put bikes on buses, and then certainly to get people out walking. And what I say is mobility is a means to an end. We live our lives by being mobile. So it's how we live our lives, whether it's going to work, to the grocery store, out to eat, to socialize. We need to be mobile. So we think about those kinds of things. And mobility is expensive. Transportation is typically the second highest expense for an individual or a family after housing. And those two costs are typically 50% of where your spending goes, and they can interplay. We know more and more communities in Montana are getting expensive to live in. So Bozeman's a classic example. So a lot of people move farther out to find that affordable housing, and then it means their commuting costs are going up. And so certainly we see some of those areas with high priced housing where to fit that magical 33% of your income is going to housing, your transportation costs can actually go up, and it can be very expensive for people to get around. The American Automobile Association every year puts out what they call your driving costs. And so they do an estimate of, depending on what kind of car you're driving and how many miles, what that cost is to you on an annual basis. Overall, the amount tends to be quoted as $8,500 a year to own and operate a car. Certainly the larger vehicles and the more miles you drive is going to change that. So again, as you think about where you're living and how much you're driving per day to do what you need to do, to think about that cost of your mobility. And as we talk about EVs, the cost of maintenance and fuel per se might come down. So as more EVs come out, we'll see what these costs look like, but it is expensive to own and operate a car. One time I was at a conference and someone started out the presentation by saying, "Are you a 1%er?" And I, of course, was thinking from the income perspective. And I thought, man, if I have that much money, I probably wouldn't be sitting in this conference. But what he talked about is how we use our vehicles. And he pointed out that for most of us, if we had an hour meter on our vehicle that said, when are you actually driving? He said, most of us actually drive just about 1 hour a day. So 1/24 is 4.2%. And then he said, well, most of us, if we think we have a 4-passenger car, most of the time we're the only one in it. So multiply that by 4.2%. And he said, so most of us are using 1% of our car's capacity. And he said, not that I want people to go out and drive more, but think about it. You're spending $8,500 a year on an asset and you're using 1% of its capacity. And that maybe doesn't make a lot of sense. And so one of the things as we talk about EVs coming into the fleet, the other thing that comes alongside that a little bit is autonomous vehicles. And so we need to think of what the interplay is going to be between those different types of vehicles, and will it change how we own vehicles? Will we not own our own vehicle, but a percentage of a vehicle? I think about if I could summon an autonomous vehicle when I needed to go home, and then that vehicle could go pick up somebody else, I might not need my own vehicle parked out in the parking lot, because as this says, for most of us, our vehicles are mostly just parked, whether that's at work or at home or somewhere else. We're not using them very often. One of the things that Larry Flynn talked about was how we are paying for our roads and the related transportation infrastructure. And he made an interesting comment that during the pandemic, we know that the amount that people traveled was greatly reduced because a lot of us weren't driving into work or going other places like we used to. And I found in 1966 this cover of Asphalt magazine, and it was interesting because they talked about how with improved asphalt we can make more roads for fewer dollars, but those better roads means more people will go out and travel, and that will generate more gas tax, so then we can build more roads and maintain that pavement, and it eases congestion and we get more people out traveling. So they're like, this is this magic circle, this perfect circle. But really more and more now we're saying, maybe this is not the best way to pay for our roads, because do we want people out driving so we have this revenue to maintain them? Then are we causing congestion because we want people out driving? And then we say, well, we have to solve that congestion that maybe we're creating. And so as we talk about how to generate that revenue as we move to electric vehicles, do we want to have a system where we say, well, we hope everyone's out driving them because that's how we'll pay for them? And then as Kyla pointed out, 80% of electric vehicles right now are charged at home. So if you say that fuel for the electric vehicle is coming off the same meter at your house where your TV and, washing machine and your refrigerator and all the electrical appliances in your house is being metered, how do you tax that electricity that might be going to the electric vehicle? So as Maureen is going to talk about later, a lot of states are starting to look at, is it a vehicle miles traveled tax, or how do we generate that revenue from the electric vehicle to replace those gas tax dollars? One of the things to consider as well is what we've done with the federal gas tax. So the current rate of the federal gas tax, 18.4 cents a gallon, was set in 1993. And what this chart shows is just something to look at that gas tax in relationship to something else. I picked a first class postage stamp. And so in 1993, the first class postage stamp cost 29 cents. And we see over time, what has happened is the federal gas tax rate has stayed this flat line. It has not increased. We see what a postage stamp has done, and then we look at what that federal gas tax would be if it kept up with inflation. So we see this gap right now, and as we talk about the Highway Trust Fund, as Larry pointed out in the previous round of the webinar, of how much money Montana gets from the federal sources to maintain our roadways. And obviously by this maintaining a flat line, that means less revenue coming to Montana and all the other states. And as again, we think about electric vehicles becoming more and more percentage of the fleet in Montana, to think about how we replace that and maybe correct some of this that we've seen on the federal side. One of the things about switching to EVs, however, is that we address a lot of the waste that we have right now with internal combustion engines. they are not very efficient from the standpoint of taking that fuel and converting it into power. We see a lot of energy losses, primarily through generating heat. A big percentage of the loss of that efficiency in internal combustion engines, and a lot of other things. We know electric vehicles have better torque to the wheels, and so a more efficient use of that energy. So obviously switching to EVs is going to address a lot of these issues. And the other thing that it's going to address is the fact that transportation is a huge part of greenhouse gas emissions. And so, as we think about those sources, and Kyla talked about this a little bit, that certainly as we reduce the greenhouse gas emissions generated by transportation, we certainly don't want to just shift that to the source of electricity that we're using to charge those battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So as we shift to those electric vehicles from the transportation sector, we certainly just don't want to push all of that same thing over into where we're getting our electricity. And those are other things to think about, as again, we get more and more electric vehicles into the transportation fleet. So some things to think about is we think broadly about the transportation issue. So if we wave the magic wand and tomorrow we all had electric vehicles, we'd say, well, we've addressed the tailpipe emission issue. And while this is very important, if we're all driving the same, to say, well, we haven't done anything to address congestion. We haven't done other things to address other transportation safety issues. And so while the zero tailpipe emission is a very important issue to address, we have still then a lot of other transportation challenges. As I've said, what is the source of our electricity for charging our vehicles? We simply don't want to replace the greenhouse gas emissions that we have from our vehicles now and just put that on the electricity side. Another thing to think about is, where are we getting the materials for the batteries we need? As we're looking for the nickel and the other materials, where are we sourcing those from, and are we doing that in a environmentally sustainable way? And then how do we recycle those materials when all those batteries that we're putting in these new electric vehicles are past their useful life? The USDOT, the timing was, this came out just after the first series of webinars. So the USDOT put out a toolkit for talking about planning and funding rural electric mobility infrastructure. So Kyla talked a little bit about this, in that the states are looking at the new transportation bill and certainly funding for EVs in there to put together a plan. And part of that discussion is, if 80% of that charging occurs at home, as we think about the tourists who come to Montana, where are those folks going to want to charge vehicles? Certainly you'll have those people who are passing through communities and might want to top off their charge as they're coming through a community. And then you'll have those people who are staying overnight in communities and saying, can I charge it at the hotel I'm staying at, or is it an Airbnb and I can plug in where I'm staying? And so those are things we're going to have to think about. And now with this toolkit that USDOT put out, that we're going to have to think about that in our communities and broadly on a state basis. And so again, to think about that broad thought about, even if we get to electric vehicles, what can we do to still even be more efficient? So carpooling, can we switch to what will be electric powered van pools. Certainly more and more public transportation vehicles are going to be battery electric buses. But can we still get out to the human powered mode? The traditional bicycle, or even more and more, we see a lot of e-bikes out there to provide a little bit assistance to folks, and then certainly building our community so people can get out and about and walk in them. And then certainly, what are those other options? I mean, as we think about electric vehicles, you're hearing more and more about, well, let's not even have to deal with the roads. That we'll look at Uber and Lyft, and others are exploring these kinds of vehicles to say, well, we're not going to have to deal with traffic congestion because we're going to get off the road network and those kinds of things. So as we look at the future where electric vehicles fit in, to think about, again, that broad transportation network, and some of those electric vehicles might not even use our surface transportation network. So that's what I have. And yeah, looking forward to the other presenters and any questions folks might have.
We've got some questions, David, so you're not off the hook yet. I'm going to kind of start you with kind of 3 questions. I'll give them individually, but they're kind of related. So the comment starts the comment and then a question, but plug-in hybrids make a lot of sense for Montanans. Most low distance commuting can be done with electricity. Gasoline can be used for longer distances. Can you comment on kind of the rural versus urban, maybe advantage or disadvantage of plug-in versus fully electric vehicles?
Well, yeah, in the previous presentations, Kyla talked about what folks are saying, range anxiety. So, that range with a fully charged vehicle, is that going to get me where I need to go safely, or am I start worrying about whether I'll be able to make that trip? And that's where I think, again, to say, is it that plug-in hybrid, to say, if I'm getting too close and I need that little extra boost of range, that alternatively fueled vehicle engine kicks in to charge those batteries. And so we might also see, again, think about your commuting habits and how you typically drive, because what we may end up seeing too is something where we say, for most of my day to day, again, if I have a range of 100 miles or even 200 miles, I can comfortably do that. Now, when I take that longer trip, yeah, I might want something where I don't have to worry about all of a sudden I'm, somewhere between different communities on the High Line, saying all of a sudden that charge goes to 0. So I think we're going to think about having that network, as Kyla talked about, where hopefully you can charge at a lot of different communities in the state. But I think, again, think about your commuting patterns, and maybe you say that purely electric vehicle just isn't going to work for me. So that plug-in hybrid vehicle might make more sense.
Right. Well, thanks for that. Let's move to kind of the next related one of you mentioned some different ride sharing and car sharing options, or buses as well. Are there some rural versus urban differences in where those technologies might be more appropriate for Montana?
Well, similar to the personal vehicle, when you're looking at battery electric buses, you again have to look at that range, how far your bus is driving. There's kind of like with the personal vehicle, there's different ways for charging those buses. The rapid charge, where you can touch up to a rapid charger and get about 85% of the charge in 3 to 5 minutes, versus the depot charging, where you're parking your buses overnight and plugging them in. So again, looking at the range, the different systems, and those analysis being done. And again, as we see the electric motors being built for the private vehicles, we're seeing being built for buses, school buses, public transportation buses, over the road motor coaches. And that development is just going to continue. So I think, again, over the next several years, we're going to see more and more of those larger vehicles available. Kyla pointed out about thinking about, the Northwest Energy trucks that go out to repair power lines. Are those going to be electric garbage trucks and those things? And certainly in Montana, we think, are we going to get to that point with our, combines and tractors and other kind of farm implements? Are at some point those going to be electric powered as well? So I think we're just starting to see that development of those kinds of vehicles, and certainly many more coming in the years to come.
All right. Now I'm hoping you're an engineer, because this question is far beyond my understanding of engineering. So from a Brayton cycle perspective, even gas turbines are at best 38% efficient. When you combine that with line losses for transmission and distribution, how does the efficiency of an EV compare to that of a traditional gas-powered car?
Yeah, I don't have that answer exactly, and some of that too will become to our the discussions of our electric grid. And as we look at maybe more electric vehicles, as we look at even in Montana, that generation of power tends to now get more and more local as we look at wind energy and hydroelectric, and even as we start talking about those small solar installations. And it will be an interesting discussion to see in the future. Again, as Kyla said, if 80% of us are going to be charging our cars at home, is that another tipping point to say, well, I want solar on my house, because if I'm going to use more energy, maybe I want that generation there, so you don't have those transmission distractions and losses through that. So I think that's going to be another interesting factor. So I don't have that exact answer, but certainly some things might change as we look at that.
All right. I'm glad you maybe knew what the Bratton cycle was, because I did not. So I'm going to merge a couple questions here together. They're kind of on the same topic. So it's a part one and a part two. When it comes to battery life in EVs, how long do batteries last? And then part two is, do we need a statewide plan for battery disposal and recycling, or is there already a plan? Or is this something that's going to be handled like the private sector? Like when I swapped a battery out in my traditional gas-powered car today, and I got a core deposit to return my other one back.
Yeah, I think, battery technology is changing, and certainly with this discussion of EVs, there's more and more research going into different battery types. And it gets to the safety as we get more and more EVs. You talk about first responders and their understanding of where to be able to turn off the batteries, as they may have to deal with a crash that involves an electric vehicle. And so, obviously we'd like to build those batteries to last as long as possible. And that's something that I think we're getting more and more research on. I think you tend to look at 8 to 10 years and a lot of those, but it certainly depends on the use of those vehicles. Are you, it's almost like with our cell phones, are you draining that battery almost every day and then charging it up, or are you just using a smaller percentage of it? And so, we'll certainly have to look at that. And then, yes, that recycling and disposal of them. Right now, it's still looking at probably that private sector to do it. So as I buy my vehicle from Ford or GM or Toyota or Volkswagen or whoever, to say, okay, when I go to turn that vehicle in, that's going to be that, person who's getting it from me. It's going to be their job to address that. I mean, one of the things we talked about in the previous session, in rural areas in Montana, we tend to hold on to our cars longer. So is there going to be something where my vehicle will kind of outlast its battery life, and so maybe I need to swap out that battery pack at year 8 or 10. You know, what is that? Do I get that core feedback? And so getting that fresh battery pack is a small percentage. Because again, the materials that are in the current battery pack can be recycled. So those are things that a lot of people are looking at, and a lot of questions to still be answered.
All right, well, I got one more question for you, unless something else comes in, and David won't be able to stay till the end today. So if you do have a question for David, now's the time to get it in. So last question we've got so far here, charging times can be prohibited for some long distance driving for EVs. Hydrogen fuel technology might be an alternative to that. Can you comment maybe on the pros and cons of those two?
Well, I think as we try and you know, get the greenhouse gas emissions out of our fleets, to say what makes the most sense in Bozeman. They run a lot of propane buses, but there's range issues with that fuel type. And so one of the things to think about, there's people who are looking at actually for those longer distance trips, and that range anxiety, as we said, is one of the ways, instead of looking at simply charging the vehicles, it's just swapping out battery packs. There was a story probably a good 2 years ago, I want to say it was on 60 Minutes, where I believe it was China was looking at this to say, if you have that long distance trip and maybe you have that, you know, very long trip. I used to travel a lot more through North Dakota to Minnesota. And so if I'd say, geez, if I have to go from Bozeman to Miles City and then, you know, sit in Miles City for a few hours while I charge a car, that adds to the trip length and everything. But if I could pull into a station in Miles City and there would be a machine that would pull that battery pack out of my vehicle and then put a fresh one in, and so in 5 to 7 minutes, I'm on the road again, I go, wow, that's pretty slick. So I think there's still some research is saying, can you do that? And that would, again, address some of these longer distance trips. But again, I think for most of us, we need to say, geez, on my day-to-day, I would think most of us aren't typically doing more than 100 miles, certainly, and probably more like 50 miles. So that range is not going to be an issue. And then maybe it is for some of those longer trips. It's just, hey, we're renting a different type of vehicle. But if we have that different type of, you know, we're just some of those people who normally are driving a long range, as we talked about earlier, that's maybe where that plug-in hybrid, so you don't have that range anxiety that, you know, if you're going to be traveling a distance that exceeds that normal battery life, you have that engine that helps you get that power.
All right, David. Well, I think that's all the questions that we've got so far that have come in for you. So I know you've got to jump to another meeting. Thank you very much for all the knowledge you shared with us, and specifically that Asphalt Magazine exists. That was something I just had no idea. You know, the things you learn when you show up at these meetings, right?
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. And yeah, I can stand a little longer looking forward to what Maureen has to say, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. All right, well, our next presenter is Maureen Bock, who is with the Oregon Department of Transportation, and I like her title, Chief Innovation Officer, something maybe you don't think of when you think of transportation. Maureen has some pretty strong Montana roots. She's a Montana native, but what we specifically asked Maureen to do today is Oregon's several years ago started looking at electric vehicles, and they had a pilot project specifically looking at rural areas of Oregon. And you know, we may think of Oregon as being a little more urban than Montana, but there's some very rural areas as well. So some of the lessons that they learn, I think, might be applicable to Montana. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maureen and let her share with you.
Thank you. I'm going to assume that you can see that.
Not yet.
Okay.
But you should have the ability to share.
Okay. And of course, I'm having my little technology issue here. So let me do something different. Pull this over here from the beginning. How about that? Can you see that?
No, but I could share for you.
Why don't we do that then?
All right,
Then you don't have to watch me struggle with my technology.
All right, I will get that up here and we'll take care of that. Let's see.
Thank you. It's a good thing I coordinated with you in advance.
That's right. We practiced and clearly it is seamless.
So when I talk about this program that I run, which launched in 2015, I always like to start with, transportation funding has been around for a very long time. And every time we've changed how we pay for roads, bridges, et cetera, we usually start with, oh, we got another tax to pay. But really in Oregon, what we found is that new technology presents new challenges and opportunities for us to change the way that we pay for things. And so one of the things that I like to do is reflect on history. And Oregon was the first state in the country to pass a gas tax. The legislature, when they did that, presented it to Oregonians as, we're doing this to get Oregon out of the mud. The real reason they did that, honestly, is because horses and buggies and that kind of thing could do pretty well on our muddy, wintry roads. Even when we filled them with logs, they were still pretty rough, but cars did not do so well. So as the automotive population started growing, the legislature was pressured into doing something to help pay for that. At the same time they did that, they also put in place a way to pay for bike paths because they wanted all of the users of the infrastructure to have their own path, if you will. So now we're looking at different technologies like electric vehicles, digital twins that are being used to look at roads and bridges, digital license plates, potentially, all of those things. All of that changes how we need to pay for roads and what we can do to fund roads. So the next slide is really a little overview of what we're talking about when we look at the funding mix. So can I actually change these now, or are you going to drive?
I'll have to change it. So if you just want to do next slide, I'll try to be a good little slide advancer.
So this is really a schematic that shows how in Oregon our funding mix has changed. Like I said, in 1919, we were the first state to pass a gas tax. And then in the 30s, the US government adopted a federal gas tax. In the 1930s, we also, here in Oregon, adopted a highway cost allocation system that actually looks at the funding mix for all vehicle classes. And that was driven in part because diesel vehicles were becoming more prevalent. So at the same time we did a highway cost allocation in our statute and then became constitutional, we also implemented a diesel tax. Then when heavy trucks came online and were causing more damage using more diesel, we implemented a weight mile tax. And so in 2001, automobile manufacturer shows up in Oregon, Salem, shows that this really highly efficient, I think it was a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, and the legislature went, that's the end of our funding for roads. If light duty vehicles are running on alternative fuels, we need to fix that. So the Road User Fee Task Force came into being in 2001. Took about 5 years to decide that they wanted to look at implementing a program that would allow people to pay by the mile. I was running the fuel tax program at the time here for the DOT, and I was like, that's the silliest idea ever. And then in 2014, we got legislation that said we should go ahead and actually implement a voluntary program. So I am now running that program, and it has gone through a number of changes. When we started that program, we were the first in the nation. Other people thought it was crazy. We became part of the Western Road Usage Charge Consortium, which includes Montana, by the way. And now there are 13 states that have had some kind of REC legislation introduced. Utah now has a program that's similar to ours that went online in 2018. Virginia's starting a program. So this is an idea that is slowly gaining some momentum. Next slide. So when we talk about road usage charge, we're talking about a distance tax. So people pay by the mile. It's similar to the weight distance tax we have for trucks now, which is based on axle weight. But we put it under the umbrella of road user fees. And that's what is looked at when we do the highway cost allocation study. What is the entire stack of fees that each class of vehicle pays to contribute to their pay for their damage to the roads? So distance tax is but one of the many things that is looked at in that stack of things. So that's important consideration to think about as we continue this discussion. Next slide. So we've come to the conclusion in our state that fuel taxes are unsustainable, and bad roads are all bad for all vehicles. In 2017-18 timeframe, the DOT did a study of what it cost economically for people to drive on poorly maintained roads. For passenger vehicles, that number is about $400 a year. And that's because of tire wear, front end alignments, and then those kinds of things. So bad roads are really bad for all vehicles. Next slide. So the funding mix really is unsustainable, not just because, fuel efficiency is increasing, but it's also because of inflation. And in our state, we are seeing more people moving into the state. And during COVID, vehicle miles traveled actually increased because people were ordering goods, and we had more medium duty vehicles on the road delivering packages to people who were working from home. So we saw vehicle miles traveled increase. We have net migration into the state. Our fleet is becoming increasingly fuel efficient, even though EVs are still a very small part of the fleet at this point, and declining purchasing power. So those are a lot of the drivers for what we're doing now. Next slide. So the program works like this. We have certified account managers. People sign up with them. They don't actually do business with the state. The account manager sends the person a device that goes in the onboard diagnostic port of their vehicle. That device has a cellular connection, and it records the miles driven and the fuel used to drive those miles if it's not an EV. The account manager prices those trips by applying the road usage charge rate, which is 5% of the fuel tax rate, nets out the fuel tax that was paid on the fuel used to drive taxable miles, sends the person a bill, and then quarterly transfers the money to the state, showing all miles driven. So the state never actually receives any information driving behavior. That's all done by third-party private sector entities. Next slide. So the impact of increased fuel efficiency looks like this. When we looked at driving behavior, monthly fuel tax paid, when we started this program, EVs were paying really nothing towards maintenance of the roads. Hybrids paid on average about $7, and low efficiency vehicles like F-150s were paying about $36 a year or a month, I'm sorry. So by putting the program in place, the next slide shows that all of that levels out. So they all are paying about $18 a month to drive that 1,000 miles. In our program, we no longer have inefficient vehicles in the program. They're not eligible. The legislature made that change. The assumption being that they are already paying their fair share through fuel tax. So that's how the program levels those costs across everybody, so they are paying for what they use. Next slide. So in the 2019 legislative session, the legislature said that EVs could avoid payment of a registration surcharge if they were enrolled in the Orgo program. And as a result, EVs are the fastest growing class of vehicles in the program. And you can see it's a very small program at this point, probably because it's still voluntary, but EVs are almost half of the vehicles in the program. Next slide. This is our complicated fee schedule for EVs. So there is a registration surcharge that just went up in 2022. And registration fee, like I said, for EVs remains unchanged at $172 for every 2 years. So EV drivers save $72 a year in registration fees if they enroll in the program, and then they just pay 1.9 cents per gallon, which coincides with our 38 cents per gallon. I mean, 1.9 cents per mile. Can you tell it's still really early here and I'm not caffeinated enough? Anyway, so this is our fee schedule for EVs and other vehicles. It's tiered based on the efficiency of the vehicle. Next slide. So in 2017, Ruck West looked at rural urban impacts, and this was their study results that they presented at the Transportation Research Board in 2017 about the impact. And they were looking at if everyone was put in a road usage charge program, what would the impact be on rural versus urban populations? Because that continues to be an issue, primarily because in rural communities, they drive longer distances to get their work done, and there's a sense that they would be paying substantially more. The next slide actually shows the results that actually households in rural areas would pay slightly less than they would under existing fuel tax. And that ranged substantially from about $157 in Arizona to $340 in Washington State. So that was pretty telling. We are updating the study right now, so we should have new results later this year. But this was true when we did the same study in Oregon. Rural populations ended up being slightly better if they were put in a road usage charge program, because they would be paying, they're already paying a lot of money, as you can see from the F-150 example, to drive anyway. Next slide. So basically, a road usage charge is just, returning to the user pays principle that has been foundational for all of our road funding since the early 1900s. So if you drive more, you pay more, you drive less, you pay less. And when we go out and talk to people about it, the program, and they start to really understand it, that resonates with them. As a friend of mine in Pendleton, Oregon, which is a fairly rural part of the state, said, that means I, driving my F-150, am no longer going to be subsidizing Portland Prius drivers. I'm like, there you go. That kind of works. Next slide. So what have we learned in running this program since we launched in 2015? That it's really important to remember how important transportation is for people. When we went out and talked to the public, they tell us that the roads are what keep them connected to their jobs, their friends, their family, what gets their goods to market. It's really, really very, very important to them. It may not be the first thing they come up with when they think about where their tax dollars go, but it is really important to them. So reminding them of the importance of that is important. Education and outreach has to continue, in part because we know that the familiarity effect is based on people understanding something and having experience with it. We also know that the public has really pretty high expectations of what they want from us. They want this experience to be pretty seamless. Fuel tax is pretty much invisible. It's prepaid by the distributor when they drop off fuel at a gas station. So when you fuel up at the pump, you're basically just reimbursing the station owner. This makes your tax a little more visible, and that can be a little jarring at times. But if you can bundle services, then that's a good thing for people. For example, in our state, we have a couple of air sheds that require emissions testing. The people that have the device in their vehicle can do that remotely. They no longer need to go to a brick and mortar test site to get that done. So we're trying to have the private sector deliver those services in a really seamless way. We know that emerging technologies are going to be disruptors. For example, we know connected vehicles are going to be expecting way more from our infrastructure than they used to. So we need to be preparing for that. That costs money. So this is a way to be prepared to deliver services in a connected environment that'll increase, safety and mobility for everyone. And it's really important to build partnerships. We have public partnerships like the one we have with RecWest, which is 19 states now. We have private sector business partners, and we belong to consortia like OmniAir, which does certification of automotive, I would say, specifications. The mobile Open Blockchain Initiative, MOBI, is working with automobile manufacturers to develop standards like the vehicle identifier. The VID is basically the beginning node of a blockchain and will be like the birth certificate for vehicles in the future. 5G Automotive Alliance is where everyone gets together and looks at mobile connectivity, moving from 4G connectivity to 5G. And so by being involved in those, we can socialize the use case for road usage charging. And that is it. I think the next slide is just my contact information with a really nice picture of part of a sign on our West Coast Electric Highway sites that are actually 44 sites that we've done in public-private partnership to refurb.
Well, you might think you're done, but we've got a slew of questions for you.
I'm sure you do.
Don't go anywhere. We've got a big list here.
I was going to go get more coffee.
Yeah, we might need that, and maybe we'll even bring you back at the end too if there's some further ones there. So let's start with maybe one of the simpler questions. How does this program deal with out-of-state visitors, or if the people in your study travel to another state? Great
question. So currently we don't do anything with out-of-state drivers. We assume that if they're driving in our state and they fuel up, they are paying their fair share through fuel tax. We did do an interoperability pilot with the state of Washington, where some of our drivers drove in and out of, Washington with an assumed direct rate up there because they don't actually have a program. And what we did when we created the program to handle driving interstate is we set up rule identifiers for every state, Canadian province and Mexican state, and geofenced all of those areas. So when you cross a state line, the device by GPS knows where you're at. If you have a non-GPS device, which we offer in the program, then all miles are presumptively driven in state. So that's how we know what miles are subject to the road usage charge rate here in Oregon, which ones are not.
All right. Well, thank you with that one. We got now. There's kind of be a series of questions that are a little bit related. So the answers may merge a little bit together, but we'll start with this. Did any people have sort of privacy concerns regarding collecting their mileage data when you were talking to people about enrolling in the program?
Yes, there were lots of privacy concerns actually. And so our statute is based on protection of privacy. And actually it was negotiated with the ACLU of Oregon before it was put in place. So the account manager that gets the information about driving behavior can only keep that information for 30 days after account settlement. And then it has to be destroyed. If law enforcement wants to get that information, they need to get a warrant issued by a court and get it directly from the account manager. And all information is aggregated and anonymized when it comes to the state. So those are the privacy protections that are in place. That said, I will tell you that we've had a couple of people that had vehicles stolen and were able to recover their vehicles because they had the device in their vehicle. So not all driving behavior is yours necessarily. Just kind of funny, but those are the privacy protections we currently have in place.
Maybe the owner of the vehicle could get a little discount for those miles that weren't actually them driving.
Well, they were using our roads though. That's my, my teeny tiny little tax collector heart says.
Maybe we can get then, maybe as part of the car theft, they can pay an extra, $2 back to the transportation fund for their use. All right, next up here, do you see that being, if the program no longer became voluntary, what kind of issues might you expect to see with that technology?
That's a really good question. In fact, last legislative session, which was 2021, there was a bill introduced by the Road User Fee Task Force that would have made this a mandatory program starting with model year 2027 vehicles. And that would have meant we would have been going live in 2026. Obviously, asking people in a mandatory program to put a device in their car, which can be easily removed, is not going to be feasible. So we are working towards being able to get the information we need to run the program directly from the vehicle through the onboard telematics.
Okay.
The 5-year plan is that we will build a connected vehicle ecosystem that enables us to get access to the data we need to run the REC program, and that will also serve as the basis for a lot of ITS functionality.
Okay, so kind of a suite of programs that would work together.
Right.
All right, so, and this might, again, related, last of the three here that are related. My insurance company recently offered me the ability to plug in a small device and then charge based on how I drive. Is this the same technology that you're utilizing?
It is exactly the same technology. So one of the other efforts we have going on is something we call development of a mobility marketplace. And that envisions having the citizen at the center of a suite of transportation related services, using their vehicle as a way to pay. The Society of Automotive Engineers has recently adopted a standard for mobile payments. It's the J3217, if anybody wants to go in the weeds and look that up. But that is being certified right now. We're starting the certification process, and that envisions people being able to pay for road usage, charging, and tolling essentially, but the same kind of technology is available to pay for user-based insurance, remote emissions testing, potentially parking. So all of those suite of services could be paid for from one wallet. And so in a mobility marketplace sense, it's really mobility as a service with a payment mechanism attached. But yes, right now it's the same technology, that little device, same thing.
All right, well, thank you. All right, next one here's a little more technical. In your study, it says, I assume there are EV corridors in Oregon. And did you see different driving behaviors for people that lived farther from those corridors, from those that live right on the corridors?
So that's a great question. Let me think about I'm not sure that we see different driving behavior. So we identified a number of alternative fuel corridors in the state. Some of them are EV corridors, some of them have other fuel types. But when we put in place the West Coast Electric Highway 10 years ago, that was primarily in the rural or the urban parts of the state. So it's really the I-5 corridor on the east side and out on the coast. Those sites are kind of at the end of life right now, so they're in the process of being refurbished through a public-private partnership that we have. But we don't actually monitor behavior. Our private sector partner actually gets the information about usage of those sites. We get phone calls when they're down, but they actually monitor the behavior of, how many times they're used and that kind of thing.
Okay.
And one of the other kind of interesting things is there is a fairly major intersection in a rural part of Oregon where 84 is bisected by 395. And there are a number of freight yards in that area. So that county, Umatilla County, is looking at developing a state-of-the-art truck stop that includes EV charging for Class 8 vehicles, which is pretty exciting for us.
All right. Well, thank you. We're not done yet. We've got more. So next up, is charging user fees based on the weight of the vehicle important?
So the way our roads are designed, any vehicle 10,000 pounds or less is doing about the same amount of damage, which is why we've tied the road usage charge rate for passenger vehicles to the fuel tax rate. We already have a weight mile program in place for our heavy duty vehicles that are, we define as those over 26,000 pounds. There's some nuances that based on axle weight, but what we're looking at now is what do we do with those medium duty vehicles and the weight of those. And it looks more and more like they'll end up being in a weight mile program because they're also becoming highly efficient and electrified. So that'll probably be the next phase.
All right. So it doesn't matter whether I drive my minivan or my car, is what you're telling me.
Right. If it's under 10,000 pounds, it's doing the same damage.
Okay. Do you think tying these various taxes to inflation is helpful?
I'm not so sure it matters if I think it's helpful as long as the legislature doesn't.
All right.
So, I mean, you know, part of it is our revenue in, you know, that we generate here at the DOT is constitutionally dedicated to our maintenance of roads and bridges and our infrastructure. And so we're very mindful of the impact of what we charge in our revenue and what that means for what we can actually maintain and provide citizens. You know, a lot of states do index their fuel tax to inflation. We've never done that. And part because the legislature's always wanted to have control, and I understand that. You know, makes just a little more visibility, I think, into the rates that are charged.
Okay, thank you. Next up, what is Oregon's plan to use the infrastructure money that was provided for charging stations? Will there be public-private partnerships?
Great question. We're still trying to figure that out. I'm assuming there will be public-private partnerships, in part because we've already started down that path. We recently, though, established a climate office, and they're really going to be way more involved in locating those charging stations and the distribution of those funds.
Okay. Next up, kind of different end of the spectrum here. On the Drive More, Pay More program, is that only for public roads? For example, if you're in an HOA that's responsible for their own road maintenance within a subdivision, do those miles still get taxed even though they're being paid for through HOA dues?
So Oregon has a very interesting approach to what's considered a public road. Public roads are defined in at least 5 different places in our statute, and basically comes down to if they're publicly accessible, they're considered public roads. So I live in an HOA community. Our condominium association pays for the roads, but we pay, you know, use our fuel tax to drive on those roads. So the idea is that you're paying either fuel tax or road usage charge, you would pay for those roads. If someone really wants to make the argument that they are driving on non-public roads, say in a ranch situation where they actually do maintain a long stretch of road and it's not generally accessible to the public, then we have a refund mechanism for them to do that, to get a refund. And it mirrors basically what we do in the fuel tax world.
Okay. Like with the dyed diesel program.
Right.
Yeah. All right. All right. Let's see here. One more. What are the most important studies that still need to be completed from your perspective before setting EV taxation policy?
That's a really good question. For me, it's not so much studies as familiarizing people with the concept. For example, our next large body of work is working with automobile dealerships. So the process to enroll a vehicle at point of sale is pretty seamless. So we're getting ready to do that. We've done some clearinghouse work with state of Washington, state of California. So we're looking at how do we employ blockchain to potentially do that clearinghouse functionality without taking into consideration cryptocurrency, but just using blockchain. So it's really a matter of defining the technologies that enable the program and figuring out how to incorporate them into the program more than anything else. A lot of the studies that are being done on the, for example, on the East Coast, relate more to public outreach, how to get the public to understand and accept the program. And then that body of work will have to continue in the foreseeable future. It's not necessarily intuitive.
All right. So, and I did hear earlier you're updating the current study as well, correct?
Right. And we're getting ready to do a study on equity as it relates to ICE vehicles versus EVs. And that looks at it through the highway cost allocation lens. It looks at it through the tax equity lens of horizontal and vertical equity, and then social equity. So we're going to do that study, and then we're actually going to do another study on that focuses more on medium duty vehicles and how looks at the trajectory of efficiency there and electrification.
Right. And we've had another one come in. I thought you were off the hook, but how many electric vehicles are registered in Oregon?
I think the last number I saw was around 20,000. It's probably
Okay.
a little higher than that now.
Mm-hmm. And off the top of my mind, what's the population of Oregon roughly?
We have 3.6 million passenger vehicles licensed in the state.
Okay. And I think I saw in one of the other slides, Montana is somewhere in the 700,000 range. So you're about 4 or 5 times larger in that sense. All right. Well, Maureen, if you're able, if you can hang around, we'll go to our next presenter, but maybe we'll have some more questions that come in as well. So.
Oh, I'm going to correct my answer. Apparently in 2021, we had 38,000 registered EVs.
Okay. All right. On the fly information. So, all right. Well, thank you, Maureen, and thanks for taking the time to answer those questions. Let me go to our final presenter here today, Trevor Graff. And Trevor, we've asked him to give kind of a legislative perspective. Trevor is not a politician, but rather he works for the Montana Legislature Interim Transportation Committee. So he's one of the ones that does a lot of the research to provide some facts to our representatives and senators as they make some policy choices going forward. So Trevor, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Joel. And first, I'd just like to start by saying thanks to Montana State Extension and Joel for putting this together, and Nick as well for having some conversations with me offline. It's been fun so far, and I'm happy to be here. I thought in thinking about what would be useful in this context, given that we've already heard in the first segment great presentations from Kyla Mackey at Montana DEQ and Larry Flynn, colleagues who are also heavily involved in the legislative committee's work. I thought I'd give you 3 different things, really. One, how to keep track of the legislature. One of the biggest questions I get most often is, where can I find this stuff? So I think we'll start with that. And I just want to share with you the Montana site and dial you all into where this is happening online so you can track these discussions. And then we'll get into some legislative history. Just a second here. I'm hoping this will follow along with me. Did it go, Joel? Perfect.
It looks good.
So let me get this in full screen. This is the homepage, leg.mt.gov of the Montana Legislative website. And very quickly, everything you would want to find on the committee front is under this committees tab. In this particular case, I'm usually working in the energy world, but we're going to go down to transportation. And you'll find the list of the legislators here, but most importantly, the information for the upcoming March meeting right there. You'll find an agenda. These are still works in progress until a little bit closer to the meeting date, but all of the meeting materials will be posted. We'll talk a little more about this report later, but that's the best way to find the legislature in the interim. The other thing to note is if ever you get down the rabbit hole of trying to find old electric vehicle bills, this is the old laws system. You can click into a year up here. There's multiple search functions. If you know your bill draft number, that's easiest, but often we don't. And if you really don't know what you're looking for, you can find the list of all of the bills right there. So just know that, and also know that if ever you need help finding something, you can always call me as well. So with that, I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of the legislative cycle. Before I start throwing text at you, I thought we'd just talk about that. So beyond where do I find stuff, how do I keep track of stuff, the second question we often get is, what in the world is going on at the Capitol in those months outside of the 4-month legislative session? So I think the important thing for folks to know, especially the engaged public, is this really is a 2-year cycle in Montana. It's a biennial legislature, but these folks aren't just working in the 4 months of the legislative session. We're currently in the legislative interim. That's a 15-month process in which we get to take a deeper dive at some of these topics. In the Transportation Committee this go, one of those topics is EVs. A lot of the folks that Joel has put together for you today have been in committee already discussing these issues. And I believe Maureen is coming in next meeting to talk a bit about the road user fees with the legislature. So know that those folks are continually working. I did see that Chairman Diane Sands from the Transportation Committee is on today. So there are basically every other month a meeting in regards to transportation at the legislature if you're interested. So with that, I thought I'd give you kind of a snapshot of how we got where we are in Montana. And the important thing to note, in my opinion, is Montana is still very early on in its policymaking process in regards to electric vehicles. The state has really only one major statute on the books regarding electric vehicles at this point. Those discussions surrounding EVs started in earnest in 2019 with House Bill 456 from Representative Chris Pope out of Bozeman, representative at the time, senator now. And that discussion was focused on kind of the other side of this discussion. Currently, the legislature is focused on fuel tax revenue replacement, but this discussion was focused largely on the utility side of charging stations. That bill now lives in 69-8, 801 through 804. And in 2019, what that bill did essentially was set the framework for rate making in regards to electric vehicle charging stations. That bill really took a 3-pronged stab at setting that framework, focused largely on creating a rate class. It requires utilities to create a separate rate class for electric vehicle charging stations that will preclude the utility from subsidizing the cost of power for those charging stations from other customers or customer classes. So the argument that a charging station will impact the regular residential ratepayer was kind of taken away by that bill. Essentially, you're going to hold separate the charging station rate and charge those customers to fully recover the rate, and only those customers for the costs surrounding charging stations. The other discussion that came up in 2019 was this discussion surrounding FERC regulation of resale power. And that discussion really harkens back to the very initial stages of the building of the electric industry, in which FERC and the federal government did not allow folks to resell power as essentially a commodity. So you're not going to sell electricity to a gas station and have the gas station charge you as you would the commodity of a gallon of gas. It set the standard in that bill for charging based on providing the service or the time on the charger. It's still kind of a murky situation there with FERC and other states having gone ahead and said, we're just going to do it anyway. But currently, I think that is rife for a little bit more work in Montana in the future. The other existing statutes are essentially tax incentives. They are alternative fuel vehicle conversion tax credit. It allows businesses and individuals who are eligible under that part to gain a tax credit of up to 50% on equipment and labor costs for the conversion of vehicles to those alternative fuels, EVs or electricity being one of many of those alternative fuels. There's also a tax incentive for companies building alternative fuel technology, and that includes, at least to some extent, some electric vehicle incentives too. What most of you are probably aware of from last session is HB 188. HB 188 was the first attempt in the legislative session in 2021 to set a flat fee to replace that fuel tax revenue. And it was really born by a 2019 legislative study that was passed at the same time as that HB 456. That study directed the interim committee. At the time, it was in the Energy Interim Committee to take a closer look at EVs from not only the fuel tax perspective, but also that electric side, the utility impact, be it transmission infrastructure or rate making or any other issues surrounding that. One other point that was thrown into that study resolution was to take a look at the possibility of electrifying the state's fleet. They did discuss a bit fleet electrification, but did not at the time pick up any further on that topic. So what really came out of that study, though, later on in the session 2021 was HB 188. It would have set a flat additional fee to the existing registration fees for Montana vehicles, the $195 for light vehicles, $375 for heavy vehicles. Those vehicles with a capacity in excess of 1 ton and a gross vehicle weight less than 26,000 pounds, and then $1,300 for vehicles with a gross combination weight more than 26,000 pounds. And ultimately, I think that discussion is what ended up tripping up House Bill 188. It was the fees were amended higher in the discussion, and ultimately the bill was vetoed by Governor Gianforte. And just for some perspective, these are light duty fees across the country. 30 states actually levy light duty fees in some form or another. And you can see that, the light duty fees in 188 weren't completely outside the norm. It was really the heavy duty vehicles that tripped that bill up. So from there, let's see if I can stop my share here. We've reached the current interim, and the Transportation Committee, without a study resolution passed in the legislative session, decided to pick up the EV discussion again with more of a focus on figuring out fuel tax revenue replacement. To this point, the committee has taken a look at other states' fees holistically. They've taken a look at the flat fee structure with some particular interest in the Oklahoma model of basing a flat fee on a gross vehicle weight and kind of graduating those fees up for higher weight, higher impact vehicles. And in their next meeting, they're going to take a harder look at these road user charge programs, particularly the Oregon model. And I think the takeaway here with the fuel tax discussion in the legislature is it's still early in the vein of this conversation in the state of Montana. So this is the time to be involved. This is the time to really help shape that policy if you're engaged in this issue. Let's see. Beyond that, I think you could characterize the level of interest at the legislature as you know, really gaining steam at this point. And legislators have a pretty good understanding of the issue that's coming. I do think that there is some understanding by a few of the folks that it's kind of a chicken and the egg issue, but I think as more deployment happens, there will be more and more discussion of the EV market and EV issues, especially on the utility side. In the Energy Committee, we aren't currently directly studying EVs, but EVs seem to come up in every single discussion we have about load growth and the impacts to the transmission grid. And particularly with the boost in ARPA money coming in and DEQ's programs to build out the EV charging corridors in the state, folks are concerned a little bit about the impacts to the grid and what that might mean in the future. And I think with that, I'll leave it there and stand for questions, Joel.
All right, well, thank you. We do have several questions. Let's start with this one. You mentioned Montana's somewhat early in the process. Which states are further along down that road?
So at least in our look at this, you know, we typically focus on our western states neighbors, but most of the coastal states are further along. Most of the more urban states are further along. I think it's maybe a bit of a generalization, but you can certainly point to Washington and Oregon as a close example, California as well, of states with robust incentives and robust programs surrounding EVs on the fuel tax side. I think in general, a lot of utilities are still in the position of understanding that load growth is going to be significant as the transportation fleet electrifies. But at least in my discussions with regional utilities, no one knows quite how large that impact could be quite yet. I think there is some reticence to jump ahead and build that infrastructure out too quickly, ahead of the curve. But those are policy decisions that the legislature is grappling with. At what point do you really ramp up that infrastructure build out and try to create policy that promotes that?
All right, well, I'm glad you segued a little bit for me to this next question. So I'm going to first make an announcement that just a reminder, our May 6th session, we'll have someone from Northwest Energy and from one of the rural electric co-ops on to hopefully address a little bit of that. So you mentioned it, so we'll follow up with this, but feel free, Trevor, if you want to just pass this to our next session 3, because it's kind of a utility type question. So Electricity demand typically peaks around the 5 or 6 hour if EV owners charge their vehicles when they get home, also around that 5 to 6 hour. Then electricity demand is going to increase during a peak time. This increased demand is likely to come faster than infrastructure like generation or power lines can accommodate. Are legislators working on policies to incentivize EV charging to take place away from that peak usage time?
Yeah, so the discussion here is centered around what we call time of use charges, and I won't speak for my legislators or speak for the utilities, but the key to the time of use charges is really incentivizing or developing smart grid technology. So you have that smart tech on the grid to help promote the charging at the right times. A smart meter would allow you to essentially plug your EV in the garage, and it would direct the charging to the off-peak hours later in the night or middle of the day if you're plugged in. So those are policy options that are out there. Those discussions have happened kind of tacitly at this point, not really around EVs specifically in the legislature. But that is an option that legislators are well aware of. The other thing I would mention is there is some opportunity with EVs being a battery, essentially, to help with grid balancing in urban areas at times of peak usage. It takes a certain amount of trust from a residential customer. It does create some privacy and data issues. Those have been a high hurdle in the past for bills of that nature. But if you're willing to plug your car in and allow a smart grid to pull power off of your car at certain times of day, it's another resource out there for grid balancing.
All right, well, thanks. And I'm sure we'll ask essentially the same question to our utility folks next week as well. So
yes, you should, Joel, because I am no engineer for sure.
Well, yes, I am not either. So it's good to have people that we can ask those questions to. But thanks for talking a little bit about that, kind of the pros and cons. And I'm guessing we'll get maybe a little more detailed focus on that next week. So this is another question about kind of about hydrogen fuel cells as being an option. Is the committee also looking at taxation structures if that technology becomes more popular?
The legislature has not really taken a look at hydrogen from a transportation perspective. There's been a bit of discussion surrounding hydrogen as a possible greener source of electricity generation, and the potential in Montana for hydrogen on the generation front, but hydrogen on the transportation side hasn't been a big topic yet.
All right. Well, thank you very much. So that's the main questions we've got at the moment. I might circle back to you though, Trevor. So thank you. And if you'd stay on here. Next, I'm going to actually bring in one of our panelists from our next webinar. He indicated he might be able to add something to a question we had earlier. So Neil Ullman from Montana Department of Environmental Quality. I'll introduce you just very briefly now that he is going to be our third speaker with our two utility panelists at our final webinar. But Neil, did you want to add to one of the questions we had got earlier?
The only thing I wanted to add, Joel, is that between now and the next webinar in May, DEQ's Energy Office, where Kyla Mackey and myself are located, will be likely starting the public outreach process for how Montana should develop a plan to deploy the bipartisan infrastructure law funding for electric vehicle charging stations. Working with Montana Department of Transportation, we're going to be developing the plan that the Federal Highway Administration is requiring in order to figure out how to award those funding to develop fast charging stations along key travel corridors across the state. So between now and May, we're going to be making some announcements. I think I dropped into the Q&A, I'm not sure if it went through to everybody, our website for the fuels page. I was also trying to drop in a URL for signing up to our email list, but I couldn't get that to go through.
Yeah. So I just got the one from the Q&A and put it in the chat window for everyone. So you should have that link.
Yep.
And Neil, if you want to shoot me an email, I can certainly drop. Oh, you've got the other one in there as well. So we're
Yeah.
good.
So if people want to sign up for our email listserv, you can go to this page. You'll sign up for email updates. Right now, the email list that you should be looking for, I think, is titled VW or Volkswagen. This is for the Volkswagen settlement funding that we've been administering for several years now, but we're going to kind of morph that into how we do our outreach for the bipartisan infrastructure law funding. So if people are interested in how DEQ and MDT are going to work together to develop that plan, and also when we announce our public outreach, weighing in yourselves on ideas that we should be taking into consideration, stay tuned on our Programs Fuels website and also sign up for our email list. So thanks, Joel, for the time.
All right, thanks. And I'm glad we got to do a brief introduction. Come back at our last section and we'll hear some more from Neil. Next up, Nick, if you're ready, I've got 2 questions that I'd like to send your way. All right, so first one, Nick, do you want to comment a little bit about that EV charging time, about when, get home from work at 5, about maybe options that owner has in terms of when to charge their vehicle?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think time of use is managed charging, and I think the grid probably has some flexibility at this point, and certainly smart metering will allow that to be a more formalized thing like they do in some places where they can turn air conditioners off at night or early in the morning to do time of use. But my own personal car has a feature in it which I can tell it what time to start the car to charge. So I plug it in at night at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, and I just tell it I want my car ready to go at 8 o'clock the next morning or 7 o'clock, and it'll then start charging during the night in time to get to that 90% level of charge that I've asked for. So there's a sort of an informal time of use charge within the vehicle. I think most electric cars have that.
All right, and this is one other one that came in earlier that I'm going to tap into your electrical engineering professor knowledge here a bit. And the question was, the efficiency of gas engines has been improving over time. Are there similar improvements going on with electric motors?
I think over time the answer to that question is yes, because I think internal losses, there's heat losses, there's all kinds of electric kinds of losses, better insulations, better materials, better construction and types of alloys in the motors. I think over time electric motors have increased in efficiency significantly. I don't know where that is exactly right now, but certainly that has contributed over time to be a better method of propulsion in terms of using electric motors.
All right, thanks, Nick. Next, I'm going to bring somebody else that wasn't one of our regular speakers, but I'm really glad she was able to attend. Diane Sands is actually the chair of the Legislative Interim Committee that is working on this study. And Diane had a couple things I think she wanted to share about some ways that you could engage with that committee during this interim period. So, Diane, are you able to speak with us?
I am. Thanks for adding me in. Yeah, I chair the Interim Transportation Committee and serve on the regular Transportation Committee. And, the legislature is a complicated, many-armed creature. And actually, there are 3 committees technically that could be dealing with this issue, both Transportation Committee, EQC, as you've heard from Neil, and ultimately probably the Taxation Committee will weigh in on this. Our committee is taking this up as a topic of study. We looked at it briefly last interim as well. And as you heard, a bill went through, but was vetoed by the governor. So even yesterday, when I was meeting with the governor, raised the question of what is it he is willing to support. And whatever he's willing to support is probably what our committee will bring forth as a committee bill to address this issue. We're also hearing a lot about what is the plan for the infrastructure money. Glad to hear Neil talking about that. We'll be working together on trying to coordinate that. Our next meeting, which is just coming up in another week or so on March 22nd in Helena in the afternoon, is looking at the EV issue, and you're all certainly welcome to weigh in. Public comment is important because this is going to have to serve the whole state of Montana, and it's a long-term solution, and the plan will be how to do this over the next 5 years. Unlike a lot of things we do in the legislature, which are really short-term, this is a very long-term issue. And there is a lot of interest. As you saw, the entire legislature did pass our last bill. So I don't think the question is really, will the legislature pass legislation? It is what legislation would best serve the people of Montana. So please feel free to contact me, our committee staff, and weigh in our committee at that meeting or in our May meeting as well. So thank you for holding this session. Helpful, we appreciate it.
All right, and thanks for sharing your perspective and some ways that people can engage there. Maureen, I'm going to circle back to you if you're ready for another question. And the question, Maureen, is about what are the administrative costs of collecting taxes through, whether it's an RUC charge or a per gallon charge or a registration fee? Have you any feel for what kind of the structure is to get those collected?
Yes, so if you're looking at a bell curve, fuel tax collection costs are at the far left end of that curve, as in they're less than 1% of what the DOT pays for any of its revenue collection items. At the far right end is road usage charging, because we spend a lot of money to collect revenue from a very small number of people. And in the middle are registration fees from like DMV. So if you look at a bell curve, we're at the far right end, and we think that as we scale it, it will come down. Currently, our account managers receive 40% of their gross revenue. That seems very high, I'm sure, and it is. But they are doing things like addressing the technology. So when we went live with the program, we were on second generation devices. We had a 2G cellular connection embedded in them. Then we migrated to 3G devices. They bore the expense of doing that. We are now going through a migration to 4G devices, so fourth generation. There'll probably be 1 to 5G soon. We do not bear the expense of that. We have outsourced that along with everything else. So we're getting ready to do another round of procurement for account management services. We anticipate that we will have the same 2 vendors engaged, and then probably some more. When we went live, Verizon Telematics was part of the market. They left, and we think they'll come back. We also think as we develop a connected vehicle ecosystem, that will drive down costs, because we won't have the expense of providing devices. So, yeah. So my thing is, this is R&D, so we're trying to fail early and small, not big and spectacular, because we all know what that looks like if you're a state governmental entity. And we're learning a lot along the way from our private sector partners. And we're more than happy to share with anybody that wants to listen.
All right, and maybe some other states can benefit from those lessons learned as well, as they implement.
Florida is known for exploding a whale on the coast. So if you want an entertaining video, go out to YouTube and Google or YouTube ODOT exploding whale, and you'll get to see that. We do not want to be the exploding whale part of the ODOT.
So I didn't think I was going to hear about an asphalt magazines, nor did I expect to hear about exploding whales today, but you never know what you're going to hear. Let's see who this would be good for. Well, maybe I'll ask it to you, and then maybe I could have Trevor follow up as well, because these are maybe somewhat relevant to both groups. What do we do with older vehicles when we adopt this technology? Is this only something that can be established on new vehicles? And then kind of part two of this question, in Montana, after 10 years, you can kind of permanently register your vehicle and then, pay a one-time fee and you never have to do it again. Is that part of this discussion as well?
So one reason that we plan on making it a mandatory program starting with new vehicles only is because we don't want to have to go back and try to retrofit older vehicles. And most of them are fairly inefficient, so they're already paying their fair share through the fuel tax. There's another really very practical reason why we plan to leave fuel tax in place. And that is because we have pledged those revenues to repay bonds when we borrowed money. And the bonding community was very uncomfortable with us adopting a road usage charge program and saying it was a replacement for fuel tax. So we have to be really nuanced about how we discuss that. It's not a wholesale replacement for fuel tax. It's only a replacement for vehicles that are enrolled in the program. So we don't plan to go back and encourage older vehicles to be part of the program. We want to start with new vehicles and use this interim stretch with the existing fleet.
All right, thanks, Maureen. Trevor, did you want to add anything from the Montana perspective?
Yeah, so I won't touch on the first part of the question because it's unclear whether a road user charge would be the mechanism in the interim committee's committee bill. But in touching on the second part of the question, the permanent plates part of the question, that's a policy question for the legislators to think about. And I think a lot of those questions will shake out in public comment as the committee gets closer to the bill drafting stage with this EV fuel tax replacement revenue bill and further in the session. So it's definitely something that could be a part of the discussion. I don't think it has been quite yet, but that's what the public comment process is all about, and that's why hearing from engaged folks on the issue is important.
All right. Well, let me, I've gotten through all of the questions that have come in. So one, let me make a call for final questions, get them in the chat window or question and answer pod now. I'll make a quick announcement again on May 6th. We will have our third of the 3 webinars in this series. And we're going to have Neil, which you heard from a little bit ago, and then a representative from the Montana Rural Electric Cooperatives and Northwestern Energy, so kind of a utility perspective. But let me go kind of around the room with our panelists here. And maybe I'll start with you, Trevor. Any final comments you wanted to share with the group?
Sure, Joel. I think the important thing to note is, it seems as if, and I think Senator Sands would agree with me, it seems as if, the policymaking process is going to ramp up for the EV topic over the course of the next 5 years. And it's definitely a long-term issue in Montana. So I guess my only point is good bills happen because engaged citizens get involved and are tracking these things. Much like the hydrogen question earlier, if it's something you have some expertise on, contact your legislator. If you need help with that, you can get a hold of me. My contact info is readily available on the website, and Joel can get it to you if you want. Certainly happy to help you out on those fronts. We work for the legislators and we work for you. So just be engaged and be involved. That's kind of my lasting point here, I think.
All right. Well, thanks, Trevor, for sharing with us today. Maureen, did you have any final comments you wanted to share?
Thank you for including me in this. I think it's really an important topic for every state to wrestle with, and I really applaud Montana for diving in and looking at all aspects of this issue because it's really very important, and it has the potential, as EVs are adopted, to really, cause harm to important infrastructure for a myriad of things. So thank you for including me. I'm a resource. If anybody has questions, just feel free to reach out and let me know how I can be of help. And because I'm apparently a guinea pig and there's no really unimportant or issue that is touchy that I don't want to be part of. So this is mine right now.
All right, well, thank you. And take note of the exploding whale link in the window there as a Oregon Department of Transportation service there. So, all right, let's go to our bonus panelists here. Nick, did you have any final comments? And I'll ask the same to Neil and Diane if you wanted to add anything as well. So, Nick, you're up first.
No, I don't have a particular comment. I just think that the panelists and the information we've been getting is really good, and I think it is a long-term educational thing, and I think the concept of looking at both the urban and the rural parts of this is extremely important, and I really appreciate Extension's willingness to help put this together and help inform folks. So thank you very much.
All right, Neil, you're last up here. Any comments or previews for what you're going to share with us next time?
We are excited about the upcoming webinar in May. That'll be shortly before the next round of guidance that we hope to see from the Federal Highway Administration. So there'll be some exciting news later on in the month in May. In the meantime, stay tuned to the Department of Environmental Quality's fuels page and how we're going to do some stakeholder outreach, get some input from the public on how to spend these federal dollars and get more electric vehicle charging stations out there for drivers to use. So thank you for the time.
All right, well, thank you. And on behalf of MSU Extension, we're happy to kind of provide this opportunity to bring some of these experts in to present directly from you. I know I learned some things beyond Asphalt Magazine and exploding whales, but there's a lot of resources out there, and we're happy to help facilitate that as well. So please mark your calendars for May 6th. We did record today's session. We'll post it to the website. So if you'd like to share it with others or go back and review our first session, that will be also posted there as well. So with that, have a great day, everyone, and hopefully we will see you on May 6th.